This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. A story about a Christmas invitation that never came and a secret that could turn a red ribbon into a noose of consequence. It begins with a text message that should have been a hug and felt like a slap. We're keeping it small this year. Maybe next time. I stared at those words as if they'd been carved into the glass, as if every casual letter carried the weight of a decision long in the making, and I could almost hear the cabin door clicking shut in my face, the door my grandfather planed by hand, the one with the pine knot that looked like an eye. My mother's sister, Cheryl, had always been the organizer, the arbiter of stockings and seating charts, and those tiny gold napkin rings that left faint indentations like bruises on the linen. She dressed exclusion in glitter, wrapped dismissal in a bow. Not welcome, she clarified later. Only she didn't say it out loud. She let it live between the lines of a voicemail so sweet it stuck to my teeth, thick with molasses and malice. I could smell the cabin as she spoke. Wood smoke, cedar, the ghost of a cinnamon roll, and my chest clenched with a homesickness that tasted like pennies. It would have been one thing if they'd simply forgotten me. Forgetting is soft, blurred by the kind of human error you forgive with a shrug. But this was a list, deliberate and clean. Not welcome. They said my presence made the air colder, that I was too intense. Too much of my father, who left when I was 8 and took nothing but the boots by the door and the ability to feel uncomplicated joy. They said I argued too much when the mortgage came up, had too many questions about the loan Grandpa took out, and the strange silence around the bank letters. They said it the way people say you're difficult when what they mean is you won't swallow their lie and call it pudding. I let them think I would stay away. I let them believe I would shrink small enough to fit inside their script, a silent extra in the background of their perfect winter tableau. The thing they didn't know, the thing they'd decided not to know, was that I had a key that had nothing to do with brass and everything to do with signatures. A key stamped with words like default and notice of sale and 30 days. Weeks earlier, when whispers about late payments turned into the unmistakable clank of financial chains, I'd volunteered to handle the paperwork because I was the only one who wasn't afraid to open envelopes that didn't purr. I gathered every letter in a folder the color of bruised figs, sat in the bank's stale office under a fluorescent light that made my skin look ashy, and learned the truth. The cabin was already halfway gone. The bank had been patient to the point of politeness, but patience is not kindness. It's a timer, ticking down to an auction block. I tried to tell Cheryl, tried to tell my mother, but they had a gift for treating reality like a rude guest. We'll take care of it after the holidays, they chirped, as if debt recognizes mistletoe. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to rush in with a miracle and a pen and make it all right. Because love has made fools of better people. But when they told me I wasn't welcome, when they made my exile part of their centerpieces, I discovered the one thing stronger than hurt: clarity. If you've ever been outside a warm window, if you've ever watched your family laughing around a table and felt your name skim across their conversation like a leaf on a frozen lake, you know what I mean. You learn where pain ends and power begins. I started counting days. I started counting heartbeats. I started counting chances, and found the number was 1. On the day I got the final notice, the clerk looked at me with a kind of weary kindness and said, "If they want to talk, they need to talk now." And I felt a bitter terrarium flourish behind my ribs. Tiny plants of thought I'd been pruning back, finally left to grow. I called my mother. She sent me a picture of a wreath and typed, "Busy baking." I called Cheryl. She replied with a thumbs up and a snowman, as if frostbite were festive. I didn't push because I didn't need to. I knew exactly where their refusal would lead. And yet, between the spike of revenge and the soft animal of love that still curled in my throat, there was a hallway where I paced for nights. Was I becoming the monster they'd painted, or was I simply refusing to be the feast? I remembered Grandpa's hand anchoring mine on the dock, the way the lake looked like hammered steel at dusk, and I pressed my cheek to that memory until it left a print. He built the cabin to be a place where no one was left outside. He also taught me that locks keep honest people honest, and consequences do the rest. So I made my decision. I would tell this story out loud, not to the people who had me blocked, but to anyone who understands that being told to wait on the porch is a declaration of war. I would tell it to you, and I would let the facts cut through the tinsel. There is a special kind of silence that follows the word seizure, a silence that eats phone calls and shreds small talk, a silence that turns a Christmas list into an inventory of debts. The bank did not care about our ornaments. It cared about the cabin, which was an asset, which was collateral, which was a line in a ledger that did not wear mittens. And they had scheduled the visit, the kind of visit white trucks make with clipboards, just days after the family's small gathering. Maybe next time, they had said. There would be no next time. Not for the cabin they imagined, not for the winter they tried to hoard. And yet, even with all that knowledge, I still wanted them to see me, to choose me, to say, "Come home." That is the cruelty of blood. It keeps you knocking even when the wood gives you splinters. But I was done bleeding for free. So I waited, a patient wolf, while the snow gathered. And I pictured the table they would set, the laughter they would polish like silverware, the satisfaction of my absence, the way they would call it peace. I let them have their peace. And I kept the clock. When Christmas Eve arrived, the cabin lights gleamed through the falling snow like a lie told too well, warm, convincing, and sharp enough to cut. I sat in my car at the curve in the driveway where the trees bent low, remembering every year I had helped hang the same flickering string of lights along the roof. How I used to be the one who tested each bulb while Cheryl directed me from the porch, her voice all syrup and superiority. Now the laughter leaking from the walls sounded muffled, like a radio station just out of range. I should have driven away, but revenge isn't born from sudden rage. It's a slow, deliberate bloom that feeds on ache. I'd already done the work that mattered weeks before. I'd called the bank to confirm the date, to make sure the inspector's arrival was locked in for the day after Christmas. I'd even sent the final set of papers certified to Cheryl's own address, knowing she'd ignore anything that didn't glitter. I didn't have to sabotage them. I only had to let reality do its job. But sitting there, watching my family toast a future that no longer existed, something mean and fragile inside me wanted them to feel it now. I wanted the truth to burst like shattering glass while the garland still smelled of pine. So I stepped out of the car, boots crunching against the frozen ground, and walked toward the porch that used to welcome me. No one noticed at first. The windows fogged from heat and laughter. The wreath glowed with tiny gold bulbs. I almost turned back, almost, but then I saw her. My mother. Holding the same mug I'd made her years ago in art class, chipped now but still whole, and she was laughing at something Cheryl said. That laughter landed like salt in a wound. She hadn't laughed like that with me in years. My hand trembled around the envelope I'd brought, the one with the embossed seal of the bank and the words, "Final Notice," stamped in grim red. I'd thought about leaving it in the mailbox, thought about mailing it later, but suddenly the idea of hiding felt too much like the role they'd written for me. The quiet daughter, the apologetic one. Not tonight, I knocked. The sound made the laughter inside stumble. Then the door opened and Cheryl appeared, wrapped in her Christmas sweater like armor. Her smile froze. "Amelia," she said, tasting my name as if testing for poison. "You weren't invited." "I know," I said. "But you should still hear this." Her gaze darted to the envelope, and for a flicker of a second, fear passed through her expression before she caught it and tucked it neatly away. "This really isn't the time," she began. But I stepped forward just enough for the light to catch the paper, for the red seal to shine like a wound. "It's past time," I whispered. My mother appeared behind her, pale, eyes wide, as if she'd seen a ghost step out of memory. "What's going on?" she asked, and Cheryl tried to block her view. "Nothing," she hissed, but my mother had already taken the envelope. She looked at the seal, then at me, and the realization spread across her face with the slow horror of thawing ice. "You knew?" she breathed. I didn't answer. The truth didn't need my voice anymore. It had its own. Cheryl snatched the envelope, ripping it open, scanning the lines she'd ignored for months, and the color drained from her face. "This can't be right," she muttered, but her voice cracked. The others began gathering near the doorway, cousins, uncles, faces half familiar in the yellow light, eyes darting between us like they were watching a show they didn't understand. "We're losing it," my mother said softly, as if saying it quietly might make it less true. Cheryl turned on me then, the brittle sweetness gone. "You could have told us." I laughed, and it sounded nothing like joy. "I did. You just didn't like the version that wasn't wrapped in ribbon." She flinched. Behind her, the fire popped, and the smell of roasting pine filled the silence like mockery. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was hollow, the kind of emptiness that echoes. I turned to leave, but my mother's voice stopped me. "Please," she said, a word small and sharp. "Can't we fix it?" I wanted to say no, to tell her this was the cost of pretending, but something in her eyes, the same eyes that once watched over me during fevers, the same eyes that had turned away when I needed her most, made me hesitate. "The only way to fix it," I said finally, "is to admit it's broken." Then I walked away, each step heavier than the last. The cold bit through my coat, but it was cleaner than the warmth inside. I got in my car, started the engine, and watched through the windshield as chaos bloomed behind those glowing windows. Cheryl waving papers. My mother crying. The others frozen, unsure whether to comfort or condemn. It should have felt like justice, but it felt like surgery. Necessary, bloody, final. As I drove down the road, the cabin's light grew smaller, until it was nothing but a faint glow swallowed by the dark. I didn't know what they would do next, whether they'd call the bank, beg for mercy, or finally realize that the house they'd worshipped was built on sand. But I knew this. They would remember my knock. They would remember the sound of their laughter stopping, the moment they realized the exile they'd crafted had a price. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, they'd finally understand that the person they'd cast out was the only one who ever tried to save them. The snow fell harder as I reached the main road, each flake melting on the windshield like a heartbeat. I turned on the radio, let the static fill the silence, and whispered to no one, "Merry Christmas." Then, as if the night itself were listening, the power flickered behind me. The cabin's lights went dark. The morning after Christmas tasted like burnt sugar and regret, and I woke before the sun as if something had tugged my ribs from the inside, a string drawing me toward the part of the story where pretending runs out. By 9, the bank's convoy had already turned off the main road, the white trucks and the men with clipboards moving like weather, inevitable and unbothered by wreaths. I parked opposite the cabin's long drive and watched the way the forest held its breath. The snow had crusted overnight. Every step sounded like a decision. I had no intention of stepping into their panic, but I'd agreed with the bank to be the point of contact, because when you're the only one who knows the code to the catastrophe, you become the person everyone calls when it starts ringing. The first truck rolled to a careful stop near the porch, and a man in a gray jacket stepped out, his breath a pale cloud, his expression professionally neutral. Behind the glass, I could see movement, shadows flitting, hands smoothing hair that no longer mattered, Cheryl snapping orders at people who were suddenly very interested in the definition of asset. The door opened. My mother emerged first, cardigan thrown over pajamas, her hair lifted by the cold. She looked smaller than I remembered. Grief will do that. Shrink people down to fit the corners they ignored. Cheryl was right behind her, lips pursed, eyes glittering with a kind of desperate authority. "There's been a misunderstanding," she announced before anyone asked, brandishing a sheaf of papers as if paper could change math. The man in gray didn't flinch. "We're here to document current condition and secure the property," he said smoothly. And hearing the word secure used like that, like a verb with teeth, sent a shiver through me not even the car heater could touch. My phone hummed. A text from Cheryl, "Come inside, now." And then a second, softer one from my mother. "Please." I should have let them drown in the tide they'd turned their backs on, but I've never known how to watch a sinking without at least throwing a rope. I crossed the road. When I reached the porch, Cheryl's perfume hit me first. Winter jasmine turned sour with sweat. And then her voice clipped thin. "Fix this," she said as if ordering from a menu. "You started it," I replied, and her nostrils flared. My mother touched my sleeve, the old gesture she used when I was a child and nightmares had teeth, and the part of me that had sworn to be granite softened a fraction. "They can't just take it," she whispered. "They can," I said, and nodded toward the man with the clipboard, who was noting the cracks in the porch and the serial number on the rusty grill like a priest reading out sins. "You signed a second mortgage last spring, remember? The one you were told not to?" My mother's hand recoiled as if the memory had burned. Cheryl scoffed. "It was a bridge. We were waiting on investment funds." I turned slowly, because there are moments when the truth deserves choreography. "From Gary?" I asked, deliberately light, as if the name didn't taste like rust. Cheryl's mouth twitched. Gary, her husband, had been the kind of man who called everyone kiddo and treated checks like confetti. "You knew," she said, more statement than question. I exhaled. I knew the bank only froze the foreclosure when someone made 2 partial payments this fall and wrote a nice letter promising the rest by December. I knew those payments came from an account with your initials on it, and that the money originated from the home equity line of credit on your house, not the cabin. I knew you were plugging one hole with another and calling it swimming. Her face fractured, just for a second. Then she built it back the way she always had, out of blame. "You could have helped," she hissed. "I did help," I said, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't snap. I went to the bank. I filed the hardship extension. I read the terms when everyone else was decorating. I begged for time, and you used it to pretend. The inspector asked for access to the basement and the main fuse box, and Cheryl launched into a speech about holiday sanctity that would have been funny if it weren't so naked. The man nodded, patient, and said the line I'd warned them about. "You can cooperate today, or we'll proceed under notice." There's a special brand of humiliation baked into official language. You can spread sugar over it all you want, but it still tastes like enforcement. My mother stepped back, blinking hard. "We'll cooperate," she said before Cheryl could turn her refusal into a spectacle. Inside, the cabin was a museum of almosts. The tree sagged with ornaments made by hands that had forgotten how to hold each other. Stockings hung without names. The mantel clock, Grandpa's, ticked like a stubborn heart. The men moved through the rooms, polite as a storm, documenting, photographing, measuring the distance between what had been promised and what was. Every flash felt like a shutter coming down on a life. I stood by the kitchen island, fingers pressed flat to the wood we'd sanded the summer I was 13, when sawdust drifted like a second kind of snow, and Grandpa taught me how to follow the grain. Gary sidled up to me then, smelling faintly of aftershave and effort. "Look," he said, voice pitched low. "I've got a guy who can float us, bridge financing. We just need 48 hours. I looked at him the way you look at someone who thinks the ocean is negotiable. "You had 48 days, I said. "And you spent them buying champagne and denial." He smiled, that broker smile that had probably charmed rooms I'd never enter, and it bounced off me like sleet off glass. "You always were dramatic," he said, and I felt something old and hot flare in my chest. "Dramatic is calling the fire department when the house is already ash," I snapped. "This is arithmetic." He shrugged and started to slide away, but I caught his sleeve. "Does Cheryl know about the second lien you put on your boat?" The color left his face so fast it made a sound only I seemed to hear. Cheryl had drawn near, the way predators do when they sense weakness not their own. "What did you say?" she asked, and when Gary tried to laugh, it came out as a cough. "Don't," I said. "Not with me. I've seen the filings. The boat is collateral, the cabin is collateral, your pride is collateral, and the only thing not leveraged is the truth." For a long second, no one spoke. The inspector cleared his throat and asked for the attic key. My mother handed it over without a word, and in that small motion, I swear, I saw her decide to stop pretending. "What happens next?" she asked me, not as a dare, not as a plea, but as a person who has climbed out of a delusion to find herself barefoot on ice. I took a breath. They finished their documentation today. They change the locks after New Year's, unless someone shows up with a cashier's check to satisfy the arrears and fees. If not, it goes to auction in January. Cheryl pounced. How much? She demanded. I named the figure, and the number hung in the kitchen like a chandelier made of knives. Gary whistled, low, because he's the kind of man who measures worth in sound effects. We can't, my mother whispered. We could, if you hadn't. She stopped herself, but we all heard the end of that sentence, the word spent thudding down the hallway, bumping into every gift they'd bought to make the silence sparkle. Cheryl turned to me then with a look I'd never seen on her face. Something like calculation shot through with panic. You could, she said. You have savings. It was so precisely, perfectly her, this habit of arranging other people's resources like place settings, that I almost missed the flicker of shame in her eyes. I did, I said. And then I used it to pay for Grandpa's medical care the year the insurance misplaced. The invoice, and for the roof repair after the storm you insisted was just a few. Shingles, I am not your bank. The inspector thanked us and moved on. And Gary began whisper-shouting into his phone about funds and windows and miracles. My mother leaned against the counter as if it were the only thing holding her up. I'm sorry, she said suddenly, voice cracking open, for the way I let them make you small. The apology landed soft and brutal at once. There are words you wait your whole life to hear, and when they finally arrive, they carry the weight of all the years they were missing. Something inside me reset by a degree. I'm not small, I said, and it wasn't bravado. It was fact. Cheryl stared at us incredulous, as if a script had been swapped mid-scene. What are you two even? This isn't therapy. We need solutions. I met her gaze. There is a solution, I said, and for the first time since I'd parked, I let her see the sharpness I'd been hiding. But it doesn't look like you think. It's going to look like consequences. She laughed, brittle. What, you're going to buy it yourself? The room stilled. She didn't know that I'd met with the bank manager twice, that I'd learned more than I said, that I'd been offered a path that was both salvation and sentence. I couldn't stop the seizure, but I could step into the auction. I could bid. I could win. I could decide what home meant. Maybe, I said, and Cheryl's laugh died so abruptly it left a bruise in the air. How? She managed. With the same stubbornness you renamed attitude, I replied. With the money I've been saving for a life where I don't have to ask for a seat at a table I set. My mother searched my face as if trying to read a weather report printed on my skin. Why would you do that? Because revenge is not about destruction, Grandpa had once told me when I'd raged about an elementary school slight. It's about calibration. Because he built it for us, I said softly, nodding toward the lake you could just barely see through the frost-laced window. And because I'm tired of being told to wait on the porch. Outside, the white trucks finished their slow, meticulous orbit. Inside, the clock ticked on. Cheryl lifted her chin and tried one last time to cast a spell with entitlement. If you buy it, she said, you'll let us stay. It wasn't a question. It was a presumption, a habit so ingrained it had become her native tongue. I didn't answer, not yet. Let suspense do its work. Let fear widen the eyes that had been so good at closing. There is power in making someone sit with maybe. The inspector returned, thanked us for our cooperation, and handed over a card with the next steps printed in clean, indifferent font. As the door shut behind him, the cabin exhaled, and for the first time in years, I felt it breathe with me rather than at me. The storm clouds broke for a fraction of a second, a ripped seam in the sky, and a single blade of winter light skated across the floorboards like a promise. I put the card in my pocket, turned to my mother, and said, I'll see you in January. Cheryl made a sound that was almost a growl. Gary swore under his breath. And in the quiet that followed, something like the truth finally took a seat at our table. January came with a blade between its teeth, and the morning of the auction cracked open like ice under a boot, brittle and loud and full of the kind of danger that looks from a distance like ceremony. I arrived early, breath ghosting in the cold, the courthouse steps slick and unforgiving, the sky the color of a bruise that hadn't decided whether to fade or bloom. Inside, the room smelled like paper and pride. Men in wool coats and women with steel pens, the quiet shuffle of people who know the exact exchange rate of memory to money. I took a seat at the end of the second row, where I could watch the door. Cheryl and Gary arrived late, of course, Gary in a suit that tried too hard, and Cheryl wrapped in a coat that said, "Inevitable." She spotted me and flinched as if the air had teeth. My mother came alone, face washed of makeup and pretense, hands clenched in a way that made me want to pry them open and put a warm stone inside. She sat beside me without asking. We didn't speak. The clerk announced the terms: cashier's checks only, deposit on winning bid, balances due within a set period. And those words fell with the gravity of planets. The cabin was a number now, with commas you could count and a starting point that made strangers salivate. I had all my numbers lined up like soldiers, every fee and penalty and tax, every miserly cent. Not just because revenge wears a better dress when it's tailored, but because I knew what this would cost me besides money, a future I'd planned like a carefully folded map. The bank rep read the description, the parcel, the frontage on the lake, the outbuilding that used to be the tool shed Grandpa called the chapel, and I could feel him in the grain of those words. The way he'd told the story of boards and gables with his hands, palms slicing the air, knuckles rapping the rhythm of nails. Then the bidding started, fast and electric, numbers rising like a fever. I kept my face neutral, my heart pacing the length of my ribs like a caged thing. A developer in a camel coat tossed in early, casual, the way people do when they think they're buying something disposable. Another bidder with a smirk and a binder pushed the price higher. Gary lifted his hand once, performative, then dropped it when he felt the heat of real money. Cheryl whispered urgently into his shoulder, and he shrugged her off, the old partnership fraying out loud. I waited until the room thought it knew the shape of the fight. Then I raised my card. The auctioneer's cadence found me, the rhythm of "Do I hear? Yes, I do." And the price climbed, my voice calm, my math merciless. Camel coat blinked, recovered, countered. Binder flicked pages like charms. I moved again and again, because what none of them knew was that this wasn't about a lake view or a flip. It was about a dock where a little girl learned that planks become a promise. If you set your weight just right, that you do not fall if you accept how the wood moves beneath you. The numbers reached a place where bystanders inhaled in unison. Camelcoat hesitated. Binder conferred with no one and looked briefly, like a person who had just remembered that houses are more than boxes for furniture. I lifted my card one final time and placed my bid like a verdict. Silence pooled. The auctioneer's gavel rose, hovered in the tragic little sky of his hand, and fell. Sold. The word cracked open the room. Cheryl made a sound that belonged in a different building. Gary swore so softly I felt it more than heard it. My mother's fingers unclenched one by one, as if a spell had loosened. I stood to sign, the pen heavy with all the things it meant. When the bank rep slid the paperwork across to me, his professional neutrality softened by a fraction. I saw myself reflected in the glass of his office door. A woman who had been told to wait on the porch and had conducted the sale instead. Outside, winter huffed at the windows. Inside, the numbers settled into their new home. The rules were clean and cruel. The cabin was mine, not tomorrow, not almost, but now, subject to the processional formalities that do not care whether or not you grew up measuring your height against a pencil line on a kitchen doorframe. I could have gone home then, left the victory to ripen. But revenge is not a seed you bury and hope for. It's a harvest you gather with both hands, and you invite your enemies to the table so they can taste the patience. I asked my mother to meet me at the cabin at noon. Cheryl and Gary followed in their car, calcifying entitlement into courage. The lake wore a skin of hard light as we pulled in, the pines sketching black lines against a pale sky. I opened the door, the new key warm from my pocket, and let the scent rush me, smoke and winter and something like relief. They trailed behind, talking over each other. "You can't just... We have rights. Family is family." I'd brought a folder, not bruised fig this time, but clean white, and laid it on the kitchen island like communion. "Here's what happens," I said, voice even, Because theatrics are dessert, and this was the meal. The cabin is no longer subject to your loans, your liens, your fantasies. It is under my name, my payments, my responsibility. You will remove personal items by the end of the weekend. I will store the heirlooms, Grandpa's tools, the mantel clock, the photo albums. The rest goes to donation. Going forward, there will be rules. Cheryl laughed, brittle as old tinsel. Rules? Yes, I said, and looked at my mother, whose eyes were wet but steady. You are welcome here, Mom, whenever you like, as long as we tell each other the truth, even when it's inconvenient, and as long as you never again make me beg for a seat at a table I set. Cheryl, you are not welcome here until you apologize. Actually apologize, not throw glitter on an excuse. And even then, you will be a guest who asks, not a queen who commands. Gary, you will never again step on these floorboards unless you've learned how to speak without the word bridge hiding in your mouth. He sputtered. You can't ban— I can, I said not unkindly. Because I own it, and because respect is the only currency I accept here. He reached for bluster and came up empty. Cheryl pressed palms flat to the island as if she could push it back into yesterday. You're being vindictive, she accused, the word a desperate flare. I thought of all the times she'd weaponized sweetness, all the holidays built on silencing. No, I said, and the word filled the room like a changed key. I'm being precise. My mother cleared her throat, the small sound of someone stepping onto a new road. Thank you, she whispered. For saving it. For saving me from pretending. I nodded because if I spoke, my voice might shatter and cut us both. We walked through the rooms together. I touched the doorframe where our heights hid in pencil. I felt the floor flex in the exact spot by the window where Grandpa had over-sanded and laughed about it for a decade. I opened the back door and the cold came in like truth. Outside, the lake didn't move, but everything in me did. Cheryl stood on the porch with her fury held like a bouquet of knives. You'll regret this, she said, because that is the last refuge of people who relied on your silence. I looked past her, to the dock, to the raw line of winter horizon, to the work waiting for me, the roof, the taxes, the long conversations with myself in the quiet. Maybe, I said. But if I do, it will be my regret, not a bill with your name on it. She opened her mouth and found nothing that could buy back the years. Gary dragged bags to the car, wounded pride squeaking with every trip. My mother lingered, fingertips grazing the wall like a blessing. Do you want help? She asked, and the question was so simple, so human it made my chest ache. Yes, I said, and in that moment forgiveness wasn't a ribbon on a gift. It was a tool heavy and useful made for building. We spent the afternoon packing the residue of a life we were done pretending was still alive. By dusk, the house had a new sound. Silence that didn't exclude but listen. I made a small fire and watched it take, the flames licking the kindling like a language. In the doorway, a shadow hesitated. Cheryl. She looked smaller, the way people do when the stage lights cut. I shouldn't have, she began, then faltered. I waited, because this was a work site, and patience was part of the design. I'm sorry, she said at last, and the words were crooked but real, like the first plank you lay when you're still learning the dock's sway. I nodded once. I know, I said. And there will be days you forget and I remind you. That's how we keep what we build. She swallowed, gaze slipping to the fire. And for a second I saw not the saboteur but the child she once was, wanting a place inside warmth that didn't demand she be perfect to be allowed in. She left with Gary, and the night stitched itself between us, not as a wall but as distance earned. Later I stood on the porch, the cold biting and honest, and told the dark the thing I'd been carrying. I had wanted to burn it all down. But it turns out the hottest revenge is steady heat, the kind that keeps you alive while you rebuild. The cabin listened. The pines creaked. Somewhere Grandpa's laughter threaded the air like a nail driven straight and true. This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and if your heart ached and your soul burned for justice, hold them both. The ache will keep you tender. The burn will keep you brave. And somewhere between the two you will find at last your own front door, with your name on the key.